I'd like to introduce Georgia Train. We're going to have a chat today. Georgia Train is a singer-songwriter, a music consultant, and is a boss lady of Hooker's Songs. I just love that name so much. Georgia and I have worked musically together for the last 5 years, as she's been my vocal coach, she's been my mentor, she was co-producer on this album, and was the backing vocalist on it, one of the many backing vocalists on it, backing vocalist and musical director at the launch. And we continue to work together, which is a real privilege for me. So I'd like to introduce Georgia to this conversation.
Hello, hi Jude.
Hello. So we're going to talk a little bit about music in general today, but really the last sort of few years of my musical adventure and how Georgia's fitted in, and some of the challenges that we've had, a little bit about songwriting and so on. So I may hand over at this stage to Georgia because I know she will have some questions that she wants to ask and subjects that she wants to introduce.
Yeah, I do have some questions. I've got quite a lot of questions just on the songs individually and from quite a songwriter's point of view, which I hope people will find interesting. But I think before we go into any of that, I just wondered if you could tell us about that moment. I remember it so clearly, and I hope that you do, but there was a moment in my living room when we were talking about the creation of this next album and how you were going to do it and which producer you were going to work with, and the daunting task of finding musicians and making sure that they were going to be able to play in the style that you wanted and that understand the influences. And I remember you rabbiting on for about half an hour, and I just looked at you and I just said, do it yourself. Can you do it yourself? And I just wondered if you could kind of talk about that from your point of view, because I think I like to throw quite radical ideas at people and see what sticks. And this really, with you, it happened and it was amazing. So what was your take on all of that?
Well, that's an interesting one, Georgia. So we didn't talk about that in the preliminary chats, but I remember that very, very clearly as well, actually. And I think it was a very defining moment for me. So I'm sure we're going to touch on some of the challenges that I, like a lot of singer-songwriters, performers have had with performing, but also with why I didn't actually allow myself to sing in public till I was 50. I'm now 61, I hasten to add. But basically also, my first album was a huge leap for me from having only started to sort of do a little bit of writing over a few years once I'd become ill with ME, and then going from there to recording an album with very established musicians who belong to household names in terms of bands and so on, and Jeanette Mason as well, who was arranging and producing the album. So that was a massive, massive leap for me. But also, quite rightly probably, I allowed Jeanette to sort of run the project, which I think was absolutely the right decision for me at that time. And then, of course, time passed. I had started working with you and had developed this little notion that I'd like to write a second album, along with a book that would go with it, just for good measure. And I was still I still had that mindset that somebody else would have to do all of this for me because I didn't have the skills, the expertise, the experience or anything. And I did rabbit on for quite a long time, poring over, just really full of angst, really, wasn't I, about reeling off various people I could contact who could produce this album for me, and and what it might involve and everything. And you just sat very patiently listening to all of this self-doubt and so on, and then just said, well, you can do it yourself, actually. You've already had the experience of one album, and that was a massive experience, and obviously I learned so much going through the process and so on. And I think also having spent time with you, and it was one of the reasons indeed that I started working with you, that sort of that thing about, Rosie and I talked a little bit about this last week, which was quite interesting, that thing about perfectionism. You know, I'd come to you because I needed to try and lower expectations of myself, and lower my own bar, and not put as much pressure on myself than I had thought was necessary, and that I had done up until that time. And as Rosie said, perfectionism is the enemy of good, actually, and sometimes just being good is good enough. And you were also, I'd heard you talking at a seminar in November 2016, I think, so it wasn't long after that first album had come out. And what you were saying there really resonated with me, and that's why I approached you a few months later to see if we could work together, because it was much about getting this right for me as working on my voice and everything else. So that was quite interesting, but that when we did sit and I was rabbiting on for a long time, that was a very defining moment, because suddenly you were saying, you can take the control here, Jude. You can have creative control. You do have the skills and the experience. And you, as you said, I can hold your hand through the process. So, you know, we can kind of work together on this. And that's exactly what we did.
And as you came around to that being a feasible idea, were you still scared throughout the process, or did you find a new lease of confidence quite quickly? Is it something even now that you question the quality of the production versus if you had worked with someone else? Do you have any fears or doubts around that still?
No, I don't. And it was really very interesting. And this happens to be in other aspects of my life, actually. You basically you were telling me that I could do something. You were telling me that I could do something, and I had 100% faith and trust in you telling me that, and believing it, and actually being slightly disbelieving about the fact I could still be toiling so much with these sort of issues. And you know, I don't know, sometimes we just like somebody to tell us that we have the ability, don't we? You know, it's not about even stroking somebody and soothing them and all that sort of stuff to get them to that point. It's just saying, you can do it. You can do this. What's the big deal? You know, you can do this.
Yeah.
So I think immediately that took, you know, I walked away from that session along the Brighton seafront, and there was such a spring in my step and a grin on my face, and it was just like, whoa, come on. And you know, and that also kind of released me, really. It gave me permission. It released a lot of the tension, a lot of the pressure around all these sort of issues, and therefore gave me a lot of freedom, both with my creativity in writing, but also in experimenting with doing things in different ways and so on.
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting about just owning who you are and where you are as an artist, and for so long the struggle is to try and get better and be as good as the person who's releasing on the radio, or be as good as this person that's got a #1 single, and my music, it'll never quite be that quality unless I hire an expert. But when you actually succumb to just doing it yourself, and that whatever the product is a representation of who you are, and that's actually really cool, and that's something that most people are really craving and connect with anyway, then I think it really does just release this, like you say, this creativity and this ownership of what it is that you've created. And I wonder could you talk about, I guess in comparison, the two albums are very different, but I guess the process of those two albums had to be different, and they were both serving of that time. But talk to me a little bit about actually what was different, the logistical side of it, and the things like the studios and the musicians, and how the songs came to be in the recording process?
Yeah, they were very, very different. And obviously, I sort of said with the first one, I gave over complete control to the person who was arranging and producing it. And that was the right thing to do. I really didn't have experience then. You know, as with both albums, the people co-producing or producing, in the case of the first one, rounded up all the musicians and things. But I think the difference was with the second, it was much more organic, and I was taking creative control over it. With the first one, I was even writing the songs. I did everything in a very academic way. So I was doing a lot of research, a lot of reading around songwriting. I did online courses, some that lasted for months, and songwriting, the technical aspects of things, the theory of music, the music business. I watched masterclasses and workshops online. So I did a lot of work to try and learn as much as I could about songwriting and everything around making an album. And basically, as I was actually writing the songs, I would also, in the same way that I would still do, come up with a little sort of musical doodle in my head and record that into my phone, because I don't play an instrument at all. So that's my way of coming up with a tune. And what I would do is send those to Jeanette, who was arranging and producing it. She would write a score, and I would then, she would write a score after I'd come up with the chords with my singing teacher. So it was quite a process, really. And then I recorded the guide vocals. She sent a Sibelius sort of little arrangement. I recorded the guide vocals over that. And then she had the musicians recording at the Livingston Studios in London over my guide vocals. That was pretty special, going and sitting in on those 3 days. And then I recorded at another studio in London over the musicians playing. And then there were some extra bits and pieces to be added to it. And it was a very exhausting, time-consuming process. I hasten to add, I was still quite poorly then with ME. So actually, this was not only a very, very new experience to me, and suddenly, as I said earlier, you know, making this leap from sitting quietly on my own, doing a bit of writing at home, to working with these sort of people. And when you're not well, you know, physically my health wasn't brilliant, and also ME affects you mentally and emotionally. So, you know, any sort of fears that you've got are heightened hugely. So, and, you know, I had all these issues with the fear of performing and sharing my voice and so on, but they're magnified if you've got an illness like ME. So it's perhaps extra difficult. So it was exhausting. So my health had improved vastly by the time I came to the second album, but I still, you know, I still had my challenges, as I still do. But I think because as soon as you and I knew that I was going to start writing songs for a second album, already the whole approach was very different. So I can honestly say I didn't do any research, reading, watching of masterclasses, online courses, or anything for that second album. All that I did in terms of, you know, being guided or nudged along perhaps in some directions was time I spent with you. So I wasn't as concerned about the structure of the song and having the right musical parts in it and how many syllables have I got. I relied far more on my instinct, which again is something that I had learnt and suddenly allowed myself to do. So there was much more freedom. And as a result, a lot of the songs on the second album are much more simple. Some of them are very, very simple songs, very boppy songs. One or two are a little bit more sort of poetic and still tell stories, and a little bit more intricate perhaps musically, but the whole approach was very, very different. This second time was very much more organic. I sort of floated along a little bit, and as soon as we thought that maybe one song was evolving and it sort of got to where it actually was finished, then Chris would work up a bit of an arrangement, and he and I would bounce things backwards and forwards, and until we felt that they were good enough to record. And so it was much more it evolved.
It's really interesting listening to you talk about it like that, and there's almost this like you've mentioned the word academic kind of phase, and this very polished working on correctness, and then it's really funny to hear you talk about just how polar the next album is, and it almost feels quite rebellious to that as well, both musically and in the structure and the lyrics and the way that you've done it. And I think that is that something that you intended to come out in the instrumentation and the arrangement as well? Because sonically, it's way more leaning towards rock and whereas before it's very clean, polished, and I would say almost jazz. What's your take on that? Is that purposeful? Was that something you knew regardless, or?
Probably is a bit of a reason, because the first album was arranged and produced by Jeanette Mason, and she is a jazz pianist. So she's so versatile, and her musical tastes and things are very, very eclectic, and the people that she's worked with, some of the biggest rock stars as well as jazz and so on. So that may be where you get a bit of the jazz thing from, but also with the first album, and I really can't remember why, well, I sort of can, I wanted a slight sort of 60s vibe to it, and that was basically because I was a child of the 60s, and this was kind of about This Girl, This Woman, which was the title of that. It was kind of about taking that leap from being a child, being a teenager, who loved music but didn't allow herself to share her voice or anything, becoming a woman, and then age 50, allowing herself to do that. So it felt sort of appropriate, being a big fan of the 60s, everything to do with the 60s really, and being a child of the 60s, for me to give it a slight 60s vibe. And obviously the second album it didn't have any particular theme, so it was more about just stuff that I sound songs that I liked, listening to songs, creating a little playlist of stuff that perhaps I wanted to have as an influence for particular songs, that type of thing, different styles. So a bit of R&B here, a bit of soul there. I remember with The Window to Your Soul, and I've actually posted that particular song today with a little kind of homemade movie. I was quite keen to have something anthemic in one of the songs, and that was the song that we sort of introduced that sort of feeling into, really. So yeah, there was a big difference between the two, big difference.
When you listen to the two now back to back, do you hear them as being almost from two different artists?
No, I don't think so. I think it's just I don't choose to use the word journey, but I think it just, that sort of just explains it, really. It's just demonstrates, is evidence of a musical journey that somebody's gone on, really.
Yeah. And do you, if you were to go on to make a third album, teasing now, but if you're going to make a third album, do you think that the shift will be as dramatic again? Do you think you'd explore a completely different sonic feel again?
Well, it's interesting, yeah. I mean, I'd love to make a third album. Cost may come into it, but and I have often thought, what would the feel be sort of like? And it may be that I'd quite like to make it perhaps a bit more jazzy, a bit more bluesy, actually. But even I quite, and you're going to be really shocked when you hear, I quite like sort of Americana actually, a bit country or something. But I think bluesy, something bluesy could be the way that I might choose to go.
Yeah, there were definite leanings towards that in a few of the songs. So, I mean, let's talk about the songs. Again, this is my sort of geeky songwriting traits coming out now. But can you remember, I mean, for a start, there is one song on there. I'll let you decide whether you want to mention which one, but there is one song which was intended, was it not, for the first album, and yet appears on this one. And I just wondered if you could tell us why that might have happened, and how you think it has changed, because now it has to fit onto this album. And second question, I guess, is just more the journey of how long did it take you to write this album? Were these songs that were all written within a year, or was it spread out across a decade? And how did it come into being?
The second album, The Window to My Soul.
Yeah.
So the song that you're referring to, which didn't make the cut for the first album, is Second Time Around. And there was no particular reason. I think the only reason really, if there is a reason why it didn't make the cut for the first, was that it didn't fit into that 60s theme. We couldn't rework it to make it anything other than a slightly swingy, jazzy song, actually. So it didn't really sort of fit in. But I just always really loved the song, actually, and the sort of story behind why I wrote it and where I wrote it. And so I was very determined it would go onto this album. And I'm pleased it did. It was basically written, quite a few years ago. So obviously it was already written I think I wrote it in 2014, something like that. And I started writing it lying on a terrace outside an apartment we were renting in Essaouria in Morocco. And we had a very lovely sort of private terrace, which wasn't done for extravagant reasons. It was done because of my health, so that I didn't have to mix with other people, basically, social interaction being quite challenging. And I was lying on a couch with the sunshine and the clouds and lots of seagulls. There were lots of seagulls in Essaouira, and I could hear the seagulls. And this little, some of these words in this song started coming to me. I was also listening to a lot of early Melody Gardot at the time. So there was something about some of her more wistful sort of songs and that light kind of jazzy feel that I suppose was influencing that, really. And although it's called Second Time Around, it is nothing to do with relationships. It's about my relationship with that place. And it's about the only place in the world that my partner and I have ever gone back to, not only twice, but 5 or 6 times now, because we love it so much and it has such a magical feel to it. So the song is actually about returning to a place, to a country, to a town.
And the rest of the songs then, so we know that one's been hanging around for a while, but when did you write the rest? Were they all quite recent, or has this been scattered throughout the last sort of decade?
But all done very quickly. So basically, I mean, I might have had little tiny ideas, because as you probably do, and as a singer-songwriter, you might just get little ideas. It might be one line, it might be a few words, just something, and maybe you jot it down and file it away for a time when, you know, it might seem appropriate to turn it into something. And so, you know, I had a few things like that on my phone or in books and so on. But basically, all of the songs and the basis for some of the stories and things in the book, and many of them are interconnected, interwoven, I started to develop them when I was in Cadiz in Spain for 5 weeks at the beginning of 2018. So some of them are very much inspired by my time there and what I was just what I was experiencing around me or seeing. But basically, so that's how they started. And then we brought the album and the book out in June 2019. So basically, the album and the book were both written within the space of a year.
Wow.
Apart from second time around, obviously. And of course, 2 of the songs on the album are covers, but they were very deliberately chosen covers to fit in with the stories I was telling in the book and so on.
So have you actually spoken with Rosie about the covers yet? And if not, can you tell us about them now?
I didn't talk to Rosie about the covers, no. Certainly at my launch, she was very interested in Melancholia, which was one particular song that I write about in the book, but also that was the surprising hit of the launch, actually, which took me by surprise. But the 2 covers that I chose, one was These Boots Are Made for Walking. And the reason I chose that was because when I first started singing in public, when I was 50, and indeed the very first time I sang in front of people, which was 100 friends and family, at my 50th birthday party, I did 6 covers with a band, and that was one of the songs. So it was one of the first songs, obviously, that I wanted to include that. And it was about my fascination, my passion for shoes and boots and things. And then, so that was one of the songs. There's also a picture in the exhibition, which will be shown in the next couple of weeks for right here or on my social media pages, related to that story, to that song. The other song, which was especially poignant for me, was a Dusty Springfield cover, I Just Don't Know What to Do With Myself, which also has, I refer to that in the book, and there is a picture in the exhibition related to that song, which will come. I think I've got that scheduled somewhere near the end of this alternative tour. And basically, we hadn't, well, the inclusion of that song came about slightly by surprise, didn't it? Really, it wasn't expected. But I had driven up to the Midlands to go and see my mother, who's in a care home. It was the baking hot summer of 2018 then, wasn't it? And I was stressed, I was tired. I got there, I was feeling slightly bereft, really. And I lay down found a patch of shade, and I lay down on the ground, and I started warbling that song. I got the lyrics completely wrong and everything. But as soon as I'd done that, and of course I was feeling very raw and it sounded very raw, I had to, of course, sing it again and record it, because I suddenly thought, actually, maybe this should be going on this album, actually. And I'd also, back in the day, I'd also many times recorded cover versions with backing tracks of some Dusty songs, and had done some at live gigs. And I'd never been entirely satisfied with what I'd done. And perhaps that was quite simply because I don't believe anybody can sing a Dusty song like Dusty. So actually, when I got back and I came to see you, or I sent that to you, and the next time I saw you, we both said that this has to go on it. It was very hard, and it was now impossible to get the vulnerability over that I had, that was there that day when I was lying on the grass. But the purpose was to make it very stripped back and very as vulnerable as possible, really, for the album.
Yeah, I seem to remember we listened to that initial recording, which was just you a cappella, and it was very close. You must have been very close to the phone, or it must have been incredibly quiet around you, and trying to get that feeling as though you were sort of whispering in the song into someone's ear was particularly difficult to recreate that energy or lack of energy even. I don't quite know what it was, but just like you say, the vulnerability and the slight kind of lyrical slip-ups here and there, and the way that you were breathing, and that's something that's really, really hard. Maybe one day you should release that as a little bonus track, that little clip, your voice memo.
Maybe, yeah, no, definitely. You know, it was interesting. And actually, when I was recording the vocals with Chris, and it was just him and I, and it was just nice and chilled and relaxed, that was probably the hardest song for me to record, because inevitably when you're recording, as with performing, there's quite a lot of adrenaline flowing around the body, and, you know, you're sort of in there to get things right. And actually with that particular song and how I wanted to sing it, it was completely the opposite. And the first, that day lying on the grass, I was completely exhausted. I was close to tears. You know, and actually it's hard to replicate that. But anyway, yeah, we might have to, as a bonus.
You've got a little B-side there for sure. I think that brings me on nicely to something else that I wanted to talk about, actually, and maybe in relation to I was thinking about it in relation to the song Strange People, but you might choose to talk about a different song. And I wanted to talk about Strange People and the way that you perform it, and how you think your performance has developed over the last decade as well, because going from playing 6 cover songs at a celebration to what you've done now, and achieving album launches to sold out, you know, venues, and having to put on a huge performance. Just wondering how you see your performance skills have developed, whether you still suffer from any nervousness, whether you think that there's a particular song that really brings out your true performance character, or, you know, all of that really.
Look, I had a blast at my launch. You know, it was fantastic, and I had all you guys behind. So we had a 6-piece band, all 4 musicians, 2 backing vocalists. You know, the full bits, glow sticks, and the audience and everything. My performing I'm more comfortable with performing. Before I became ill, and, you know, when I performed then, the whole thing would consume me for days before, and I might only be singing 3 songs at very small venues and so on. Once I got back in the saddle again 6 years later, sharing some of the stuff from my first album, it was more comfortable, but I was still experiencing a bit of that. In the last year, when since the launch, when I've been doing things, I'm getting much more comfortable with it, and I don't have to rely upon chemicals and various other things quite in the same way. But inevitably, and I think actually it's sometimes a good thing, there will be nerves and there will be anticipation. I've always had this analogy a little bit. I compare it to sitting an exam, where there's that big build up, you know, maybe for days or maybe on the day. And then when the moment comes, you just got to get on with it and do it. So, you know, me and performing is a bit like sitting an exam, really. But with the launch, I had an absolute blast, and it was fantastic. I hasten to add, the whole day, you know, we had friends staying and all sorts of things. I spent the day in bed. I didn't get up till 4 o'clock when I was very focused. I stayed in bed. I listened to, I think it was 45 podcasts of great lives. And then I got up and went through the motions of getting myself ready, and then being taken to the venue, and then, you know, all the stages and the prep that you go through. But I had this, in terms of the performance and Strange People, which opened that show, and it was a show, and I wanted it to be a show, not just a performance, not just a sort of regular gig. I had said to you weeks before, I want to come in from the back of the hall, of the back of the venue, singing the opening sequence of the song. And you really had your doubts and said, oh, how are we possibly going to?
I thought, why is she complicating this again? Come on, Jude.
Why is Jude managing once again to overcomplicate things really challenging herself? But hell, you know, that person who has always had that little performer inside her, no matter how hard it has been to get that little performer out and share that little performer, really had this thing. And I thought, hell, if I can't do that at this launch for my second album, which is also, you know, honouring my 60th birthday, that 10-year cycle from when I first allowed myself to get out in front of people, then hell, you know, there may not be another time, you know, I have to do it now. I want to do it now. And we did, didn't we?
Yeah, and it was great, yeah. And so I think probably, I mean, I could talk about the songs for forever, but I think instead of going into every single song on the album, which we could, do you have, and this might be the last question to end on, but do you have a standout song? Do you have a favourite song from the new album, or not? Is it hard, is it too difficult a question to ask? And if you do, what is it that you connect with most? Is it a performance thing, or is it a lyrical thing, or is it a nostalgic kind of memory of where the song was built?
I think, and I've probably always said this, it's really hard for me to choose a favourite, but I think The Window to Your Soul, which is sort of the title track. Obviously the title of the book and the album is The Window to My Soul. The Window to Your Soul, I think, is probably my favourite. I just love, I love the lyrics. I really enjoyed writing those lyrics. I love the way that we let the actual melody evolve, and the anthemic thing in it that I'd obviously always sought after. It was also very much inspired by my time in Cadiz, which was very magical and influenced so much of this project. There's a line in it which is about the smile reaching your eyes that I'd had for years in my little black book, Your Smile Not Reaching Your Eyes, or something along those lines. And I finally managed to weave that into this song. And it was kind of, I suppose the song in a way pivots around that a little bit, actually.
There's a sense of sort of achievement, really, with this song, by the sounds of it.
I think so. And I enjoy listening to it. I love performing it. I love performing all the songs on this album, actually. You know, I've had a lot of fun and got a huge amount of pleasure and pride and sense of achievement from performing these songs, obviously with the band, you guys, back at the launch in June last year, but also, you know, more recently, where I'm letting the songs evolve a little bit in a much more stripped back way, playing with Gavin and Katie, just a guitarist and a saxophonist, and we're giving one or two of the songs a slightly different sort of feel to them as well, really. But you know, and hopefully we can do that on many more occasions.
Brilliant.
There we are. I think we've talked for Britain. So
I could go on, but I'm looking at the clock as well, and I'm aware that you said that Rosie had managed to keep it to a nice, concise 20 to 30 minutes, and I'm seeing 51, 52 minutes.
Okay, well, there you go. You know, this is, we could both carry on talking about this, I'm sure, and we can do that another time, I reckon. But look, Georgia, thank you so much. Thank you so much for everything, actually, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and questions and conversation today. And I hope that people, when they watch this, will get as much enjoyment out of it as I have done. Yeah. So massive thank you.
Well, thank you, Jude. It's been a pleasure to be involved. Real pleasure.
Fabulous. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.